Just look at the number of reviews in a niche or a subgenre that you're interested in. And if there are 100 reviews, there's going to be an audiobook version of that book. And then, of course, it's the added revenue.
Sheri has been kind of a voice professional for many years and specializes in nonfiction audiobooks. She said she really loves when authors record their own audiobooks. So during this, we're going to talk about both how you can do a good job yourself and avoid some of the classic blunders, what the industry at large looks like, what it's like to work with a professional. So Sheri, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Rob.
So writing an audiobook feels like one of the difficult, unknown, and potentially expensive parts of the book writing process. But the industry stats are crazy right now, right?
The Audio Publishers Association is the most reliable collector and aggregator of audiobook trends. 2020 was the 9th year of double-digit revenue growth. In 2016, nonfiction audiobooks comprised 27% of the audiobook market, but in 2020, nonfiction comprised 40% of the market. 40%.
I heard from Scribe Media that they said that among their nonfiction authors, 50% of units sold were in audiobook format, which just completely blew my mind. And so much of what we focus on here is around trying to seed and create the word of mouth, the recommendability for books. And if you think that's like essentially doubling your audience if you have the audiobook potentially, or halving it if you don't have the audiobook, it seems like almost an essential to create it, just even if it's not a revenue driver, just to help speed up the word of mouth. It seems so important to me.
I would agree. You've got to ask, what are your goals? There are so many ways that having an audiobook helps in addition to the print edition. Audiobooks tend to boost sales of print and ebook editions of books and vice versa. Just look at the number of reviews in a niche that you're a subgenre that you're interested in. And if there are 100 reviews, there's going to be an audiobook version of that book. Audiobooks boost your visibility overall. It can relaunch interest in your print book. You can build a marketing campaign. If it's a business book, it attracts clients to you. I mean, the benefits just go on and on.
I think that last one is really important, especially for our group, because so much of business now, there's a million available products and services for everything. And voice is so much more trust building than text. I was thinking, I'm such a dummy for waiting so long to release the audiobook because a big part of our business is the community. And it's like, oh, someone's so much more likely to jump into the community if they spent 3 hours listening to my voice than if they just read the words. But let's jump into how you actually build these things. So could you talk through briefly the approximate processes?
What I'm going to say applies to self-published authors, or at least authors who own the audio rights to their book, which I think is most of your community.
We do have some traditionally published authors as well. The majority are self-published. I'd say 70-30.
If you've got a traditional publisher, it's a little different because you don't have as much control. You need a pretty good mic, but it doesn't have to be a great mic. You can't record an audiobook using your iPhone. And then you need a large enough hard drive that you can capture the audio, either that or an external drive, but you do need a lot because MP3 and WAV files are big. The studios and I have interfaces and other equipment that boosts the quality, but really you can get it done with what I've said and still have a good product.
When I bare bones my first one, I was using Audacity to do the recording. I had one of these Yeti mics. 200 bucks,
that's a great mic.
With the pop filter and all of that. And then my apartment was too noisy because I was in downtown Barcelona. So I rented a hotel room in a quiet district, threw a duvet over my head and just recorded.
That is so smart. That is so smart because you need a quiet enough space. And it doesn't have to be soundproof, but it has to have a noise floor that's quiet enough that there aren't big sounds interfering. Let's talk about hiring a professional.
Yeah, we sent the files to just someone to kind of produce and smooth out the audio track. And they basically took my raw project and kind of converted it all. They cleaned it up, they got rid of the pops, and they basically made it audiobook ready. So I guess that was like a hybrid DIY with a little bit of professional help at the end.
You can hire either an audiobook production company or you can hire an individual producer like me. There are pros and cons of each. With a larger company, there aren't a lot of them that work directly with authors. An audiobook producer, they have to read the book and annotate those areas that perhaps names that you need to get correctly. Basically, you annotate the book so that when you read it, you've done your homework. So what you do if you have to create an audiobook is you record the audio and then you listen back to the audio for mistakes. That's called the proofing. And then you have to edit those mistakes by punching in and recording over whatever you did wrong. And then what your engineer did, mastering it. Then you have to prepare the files for distribution, and that's a whole nother thing.
When I first tried recording, I was reading the paperback and you could hear every page turn. I was like, oh, that was a huge mistake. And then should I be trying to read through a chapter at a time or a section or a paragraph, particularly if you were a first timer? Just like, what's the way you would set yourself up to do a smooth read?
So have a PDF of the finished manuscript. That's what narrators ask for too. We don't ask for Kindle versions because you can't annotate on a Kindle, but you as the author have a finished manuscript. Read the book on either a separate computer or an iPad. The reason I say a separate computer is because you're going to need the computer software on one screen, and then you're going to need another screen that you read from. The industry expectation is that you record one chapter at a time. A distributor, whether you do this yourself or you're going through a company, they're going to want one chapter at a time that's finished. And then there's a separate file for the opening credits, and then a separate file for closing credits. And then there's usually a sample.
I sit down with the book and I know there's a chapter coming up. Do I read a section ahead and then sort of say that, then pause the recording, then read the next section, then pause the recording?
To a certain extent, it's personal preference. But remember, you know your book better than anybody. And so you're going to know the nuances of it, the phrasing. You will know how you want it delivered. When I do it, I've got to read the whole book so I can internalize it. But it really is whatever you're more comfortable with. If you want to just remind yourself what the next paragraph is and then hit record, that's great. If you want to go as long as you can until you make a mistake, that's okay too.
And what are some of the classic blunders? You know, when you talk to someone or you listen to an audiobook, you're like, whoa, they really screwed that up.
Honestly, it boils down to underestimating the amount of time and effort and stamina and patience that the project is going to require. I mean, it's probably clear already from our conversation that you don't just sit down and read your book. It's got to be clear. Your delivery has to be confident. You're going to make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes when they're reading, especially if it's your first time. But specifically to your question, probably background noise. That's something that is difficult for everybody to manage. You outsource the engineering part, the mastering part, and some of the editing to an engineer. He can fix some of that in post-production, but he or she can't fix an echo in the room, even like a hum in your room. So I built a recording studio in my home, and it's fully formed, just like if you've been to a recording studio. I've created an atmosphere where I don't have to worry about those noises. I know my audio is going to sound great, but it's tough. The hotel thing is so smart. Like, just go rent a hotel for, I don't know how many days you had. What was it like?
You know, I'm sitting there and I'm like recording test audio and listening back to it. I'm like, I'm still getting some distant construction noises. And I was like, I didn't want to, it's a hotel room, right? The one thing I have access to is bed sheets. So I was like, all right. And I'd read it on one of these crazy internet tips. So I just piled it all up on me. I wanted it to not sound better because I didn't want to have to spend, the next 2 days like that, but it sounded distinctively better. So I stuck with it.
What we actually have to produce at the end of the day in order to satisfy whichever audio format we're going to go for, whether it's Amazon or anyone.
Here's the scoop. Raw audio. He's going to ask for a WAV file, WAV. That's what he uses to master that audio. But when it's time to format that audio for distribution, to hand to a distributor, you want an MP3 file. So WAV when you're recording, and an MP3 file for the final masters. Rob, you did it yourself. Who'd you do it through?
We used ACX. Their like file format requirements as an example. And it's things like there can't be more than 5 seconds of blank time at the start of each track and stuff like that. The bit that made me laugh is I go, this is the mom test, written by Rob Fitzpatrick, read by Rob Fitzpatrick, rights owned by Rob Fitzpatrick. I'm like, man, this is a boring way to start an audiobook, but apparently they insisted. Then there's a few other little add-ons that you need. Like sometimes you need like a little introduction or a little audio sample, and some of that stuff you pack together. But once you've got the main stuff, it's pretty easy to mix and match and record the end caps.
Folks also also usually want to know about distribution. So we've mentioned ACX. So ACX stands for Audiobook Creation Exchange, and they are a platform for audiobooks. They match narrators with authors. They also facilitate not just the uploading, but the quality assurance part of your files. I don't think they really master them like in the way that I'm saying. There is a base level of audio quality that ACX needs. So the reason that I'm calling out ACX is because it is the 800-pound gorilla. In the way that Amazon is the 800-pound gorilla for print and ebooks, ACX is for audiobooks, especially for independent authors. ACX is owned by Amazon, and it sells the books on 3 platforms: Audible, Amazon, and iTunes. And those 3 outlets have 80% of the audiobook market. If you buy an audiobook, it's probably going to be one of those. So a note about distribution, because everybody wants to know, like, how do I sell it? And so I just said ACX, you can upload your own files, or you can work with a narrator who then uploads their files. A lot of the indie books that I narrate, I produce through ACX for the reasons that I just said. It provides protection for the rights holder and the audiobook narrator. If you hire me, you don't have to do anything except listen to the files and make sure you like how I sound. And then we do the rest. If you want wider distribution than those 3 outlets right away, there are other options. There are only a few distributors who distribute audiobooks in the market now. I mean, there's several, but if you're a psychologist or a scientist, you want your audiobooks in libraries, then you have options.
It sounds like ACX, though, is certainly the place to start. And since it's Amazon owned, you eventually get your paperback, your Kindle, and your audiobook collapsed on the same store page, which is nice. Sometimes that's a little bit slow, but it clicks in eventually. Or Kindle Direct Publishing support is surprisingly good on the phone. If you have issues with the Amazon side of things, just chase them down. So I want to jump back to working with professionals. So having your book narrated is an extremely personal thing. It's how your book is represented to a big chunk of readers. If someone was going out to hire a narrator or to find someone to help them, is Readsy the place to find audiobook narrators? How does one evaluate them?
The person does not have to sound like you, have your vocal tone, but they do have to capture the spirit of the book and be able to translate the intention of your book. So no matter what you do, if you're an indie author and are hiring, make sure that that person gives you a sample of the book. If you were to hire me, I always say, let me record a sample and you decide if it's a good match. Then I would say, find somebody you're comfortable with. You can produce an audiobook and never talk to the person, but you'll get a better product if you have a relationship with that narrator. ACX, they are a matchmaker. So you can post on ACX like a script and say, okay, have at it. You can get a great narrator that way, but it's going to be tougher. You're going to get a lot of people who are just starting out, who are auditioning. But if you want to get a sense of what's out there, then you could do it that way. There's some great narrators who do audition on ACX. I don't anymore. And so
at a certain point, you have the reputation and the word of mouth, and you don't need to be throwing elbows in the mosh pit to get noticed.
It's just like anything. If you can get a referral, then you're going to save time.
What's the back and forth process? Because I can imagine it's quite irritating from your perspective if you record 4 hours of audio and someone goes, could you try that in a slightly different tempo?
Right.
Like, is there a chance to feedback and fix things? Or is it kind of like, you make your decision and then you trust the craftsperson?
We always meet beforehand, and then I get an understanding. I have questions about the books, whatever. And then I record the first 10 to 15, and ACX stipulates the first 15 minutes of the book. And then you send it to the author to review. And that's the point at which you can say, okay, the tone's not quite right. Or if it's a fiction piece, let's work on the character. Or, I just did a fiction book and had to master a Mexican-American accent. So we went back and forth a lot, getting that right. And then once you're both satisfied with those 15 minutes, or you've received the feedback on those 15 minutes, then I am free to record the rest of the book. That's what ACX does too. So again, remember, it's a relationship. So the more you can communicate up front about what you want, the greater the chances that after that 15-minute approval, move forward and do the whole book, it's going to be what you want. And with the exception of mispronunciations or misreads, the book is the book. It's a performance art, essentially, even in nonfiction. So make sure that the big picture is good right up front. I've never had someone say, this whole thing sucks. That being said, I'm always willing to go back and fix mistakes that somehow haven't been fixed or caught, just like a writer sometimes or a proofreader might not catch every mistake. So that's never a problem. And here's the good thing. ACX provides 2 rounds of revisions once the thing is done. Authors are respectful. They know you've spent hours and hours doing this, and it's usually great. The results are great.
We had Zahid 11G on the podcast a few months ago, and he had his book, The Minimalist Entrepreneur. He published it traditionally with Penguin, but he spoke about having a director for his audiobook.
That's absolutely right. If you're with a big 5 traditional publisher, Random House being one of them, they've published your book. They decide who's going to read it. Usually, he may have had some say, but usually they're in control of producing the audiobook, and they hire a narrator to do it. And they often have directors, not in the booth, but right there live with the narrator, giving them tips about their narration. So it's a completely different process. It's not always done. Sometimes production houses, they've hired me to come to either do the raw audio and then they have an engineer do it, just as often for me to do it soup to nuts. It really depends on the publisher. I think it's probably a little bit different if you're not a professional narrator. Celebrity X has a book and they go into the studio. They're going to have a director, most likely, doing things like, slow down a bit, or the narrator will make a mistake. The celebrity might not have experience recording an audiobook. In those celebrity or major published books, who's using a director, they have an engineer on the back end to do it for him. So I suspect that he went in, recorded the audiobook with a director, and then that was all he had to do was the read.
Sounds like fun. I want that for my next one. Like, I'm imagining a hype person, just sitting across from the mic, cheering me on. Do you have a rule of thumb for how long the recording will tend to take? I assume this applies to both DIY and professionals. Like if I'm looking at a 30,000 word manuscript or a 50,000 word manuscript, how does that translate?
Remember I said all those steps, record, proof, and then re-record the mistakes. So for every finished hour of audio, and by that I mean you hit play and you listen for an hour, that's one finished hour of audio. For every finished hour of audio that I produce, it takes between 4 and 5 hours to do all those other steps. 4 to 5 hours. Don't count the time that it takes you to set up your studio, get your hardware together, get your mic together. Like once all the tools are in place and Rob, you hit record in Audacity, which is a free audiobook recording, actually music too. Once you hit record though, if you're new at it, give yourself 10 hours to do one finished hour. I mean, at least six for every finished hour.
And is there a rule of thumb about how word count translates into recorded hours?
It depends on how many words per minute on average you narrate. So I narrate between 8,500 and 9,000 words per finished hour. So to find out how long your book is going to be, you time yourself reading a few pages of your book and try to figure out how many words per minute you read. I just finished a 300-page book, maybe 80,000 or 90,000 words. It was 8.5 hours. It really depends, though, on the genre. A scientific textbook is going to be a longer read. Would you like to hear about royalties? If you are using ACX, it's clear cut. One of the reasons that ACX is so widely used is because, at least currently, they offer the best royalty share to the audiobook rights holder, not the person who narrates it, but the audiobook rights holder. And so that split is 60% goes to Amazon because Amazon owns ACX and Audible, and then they have a deal with iTunes. So 60% of every audiobook sold goes to Amazon, and then the rest to the author. And that's quite good. And there's no negotiation. Sometimes narrators will do a royalty share. When I was just starting out, I would simply split the royalties with an author. And if you think the book is going to sell well, I can recoup my investment. With other distributors, it just depends. It really depends. They have different formulations. You can negotiate. If you're just hiring someone to do it, those rates are negotiable. I used to do just royalty share, but now I will do what's called a hybrid deal, which is we split that 40% equally. But on top of that, the author will will pay a per finished hour rate. So let's say it's $300 per finished hour. But most often, I'm just fee for service. And in which case, you hire me to do the book, and I'm a work for hire. You get all the royalties from that book. You can pay a company to produce your audiobook. They have overhead like a regular business. They've got people that they've got to pay. And what they do is outsource all the pieces. Depends on the shop. Some of them have in-house engineers, but I guarantee you, who are they getting to narrate the audiobook? Me. And they pay me per finished hour. Now, those are great jobs. I mean, I love to work with publishing houses and publishers because I give them the raw audio and then they do everything else. So it's a wonderful symbiotic relationship. But if I'm an indie author with a limited budget, if you can find a really good one, you can get an excellent audiobook by hiring a soup to nuts person like me, and you'll pay half or a third what you might pay if you approach a big company.
There's so many in between publishers, and there's like enough bad that it's good to be wary, but there's also some great like independent and hybrid publishers. So it's a very hard one to generalize about completely. What do you do about footnotes and tables?
Audiobook standards dictate that you do not narrate tables of contents, acknowledgments, appendices, indexes about the author at the end. And that is because when you're producing an audiobook, you've always got to remember that there's somebody on the other end of this listening. And the goal is to keep them listening to the end. And so part of the art of it is not just what to leave out, but the pacing. It's all about keeping that listener engaged. It's easier if it's a great book, but it still applies. Let's say you've got illustrations or tables. They don't get inserted unless they are so simple that you can describe them. And I've done that some, but they've got to be really simple. Often my authors will attach a PDF and they include it as part of the audiobook. So when you purchase that audiobook, it comes with a PDF and it works great.
I've heard audiobooks where the diagram is almost described. You know, there's an arrow pointing in this direction. And I've heard others where they almost reimagine the diagram as if it was prose. And the listener doesn't even realize there was a diagram because they're just getting that point in a different way. Do you have a stance on best practice in this area?
It's exactly what you're saying. The narrator describes that Venn diagram, and not just in one section there's this, in one section there's this, and then here's where they intersect. That doesn't help the listener. Remember, a good narrator will describe the picture in a way that the listener can picture it himself. I work with authors about, okay, here's what might work. Here's how we can achieve it.
I teach voice and mainly the niche of singing, and I'm pretty certain that the new version of my book is going to have a lot of PDFs. Do you have any specific recommendations in regards to narrating these pieces into the content or not?
It depends on what's in the content. If it's like, here's the notation for a pentatonic scale, that's going to be hard to narrate. You're going to want the PDF for that. You can attach a booklet, not just like a bunch of PDFs, but create a booklet that you then attach with the audio. And you can market it that way. It's like a twofer.
There's just certain things that are more accessible and understandable when you can watch it through a video. It's like blowing bubbles is a really great strengthening exercise, which is
you will definitely want to make use of not just audio, but written explanations and probably video. The good news is we're in the information age, multimedia. Trust yourself and be not afraid to use different media for the same project.
A lot of people are using books to connect to other businesses and other professions, right? And sometimes they get slaughtered in the reviews. You know, this whole book was an ad for services. It's garbage. Like, I don't want to read a 2-hour ad. Whereas other times readers are like, wow, this is amazing. I can get more of what I wanted. And the difference to me seems to be whether it feels like value is being unreasonably withheld. So for example, if there's something you're teaching and it has to be a video, it's very valid to say, go to my website and watch the video. There's things that in the written book, you might say, you really need to hear this. You should check out the audiobook, you know, or go watch this video. And as long as it's not intentional and arbitrary withholding of value, but it kind of is forced, it feels very natural. And that's a great way to do the upsell.
I just produced a book about how to sell books on Amazon. And so what this author did is he made sure that the text, the book itself was airtight. but he included an appendix, and he also provided links to other resources, video clips, etc., for further information. So I 100% agree that you can add value.
I really like the idea that you can just cut all the kind of boring admin booky bits out of the audio thing. I like the idea of treating it as a performance, and it's like a version. It doesn't need to be word for word the same thing. Believe it or not, I did media studies in university, and the most famous Japanese subtitler of movies. And one of the unique things about him is, as a scene would get more and more emotional, the subtitles would get shorter and shorter until they just disappeared altogether at the scene's emotional climax.
Yeah.
And he said, as the scene gets more emotional, the words are less important because it translates anyway. And he's like, at that point, my words are a distraction. So he gradually removes the words as the actions speak for themselves. And then once it's back to boring dialogue, he needs all the words again because there's no emotion to carry the message. It has to get the point across.
I am co-authoring a book, and we have been strongly recommended by everyone, not the least of which is April Dunford, that we need to narrate our own book. But because we're co-authoring, how would you tackle that from an audiobook perspective?
In fiction, they do it all the time. I mean, they have multicasts where different people do different voices. Gone Girl, for example, it's a dual audiobook, and the male does the POV male chapter, the female does the female POV chapters. What I would say is don't switch off so often that it's distracting and pulls the listener out of the experience. It's the specialty of your collaborator. They could narrate that. I always encourage authors to narrate their own books if they have the time and the patience, because you know your book better than anyone else.
I would throw away the idea of trying to get it to 50-50 if you do decide to do it together. And I would basically follow Sheri's ultimate guiding principle of, what keeps the listener happy and listening. In startup pitches, there's this common anti-pattern where they're trying to be so fair that they're just switching at arbitrary times, which sounds very strange. Whereas when it's like one person does business and one person does technical, it makes a ton of sense. So I like the idea of if it's the chapter summary or like the academic analysis, I could imagine switching by roles rather than just arbitrarily hopping back and forth, because then it's like, oh, that's the science person. I don't know. I co-authored one book and I would have been totally happy with just him reading the whole thing or just me reading the whole thing. There's plenty of work to do, so you don't need to worry about it being an unfair workload, because whoever's doing less of the narration can do more of the other stuff.
I am like, the audiobook has to be out at the same time as the physical book, but I just wondering anybody's experience is.
Simultaneously is often what the big folks do, but it absolutely doesn't have to be. Just time a marketing campaign around it and work it.
I did mine, the mom test. I did it years later. No one has ever accused me of being optimal, so I'm not saying that you should emulate what I did, but I launched it years later and said nothing. The paperback and the Kindle were already selling well enough that there were eyeballs on the Amazon page, and the audiobook just immediately skyrocketed. And I couldn't believe it. I know that April Dunford, who you mentioned, used the audiobook launch as a big marketing hype, where it's like, hey, version 2's out. And she used that as the excuse to re-email everyone who had followed her during her original marketing with sort of an exciting reminder, which I think is really nice as well. I do think it's optimal to have them all out at the same time at launch, but book launches get a little crazy. So sometimes you don't get to do everything you planned. But I don't want to keep you long, Sheri. How do we get in touch with you? And what are the next steps if someone wants to learn more?
You can visit my website, which is sherisaginor.com. You can sign up for my newsletter at my website, and you can connect with me on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter.
Amazing. Sheri, you are a star. Sounds like fun. I want that for my next one. Like, I'm imagining a hype person, just sitting across from the mic, cheering me on.